The gut and the brain, a two-way street. Now, there is a heading to attract your attention. I hope I have. To discuss, dissect, excuse the pun, and ultimately explain that connection, we welcome to Evenings Dr. Martin Stebbing, head of the Electroceuticals Research Laboratory, Florey Institute, I dropped that L, of Neuroscience and Mental Health. Welcome to Evenings, Martin.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Brian.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you, and this is a topic that I found absolutely fascinating. What about, though, Martin, just for the uninitiated, a few words about the Florey Institute?
Well, the Florey Institute's an interesting place. It's actually named after, I don't know if you know, one of our Nobel laureates who is helped develop antibiotics and saved countless lives, but it's an institute that does a lot of research into the brain and also mental health, as the name suggests.
Sorry, now you go.
But also things connected with the brain, such as the gut, as your introduction suggests.
Yes, and what about I hope I pronounced it correctly, Electroceuticals?
Yes, so that's an interesting. It's an interesting word. It's basically means the treatment of diseases using electrical stimulation. And you might, of course, know that there are lots of ways we actually do that. So an example would be pacemakers or cochlear implants. But we're most interested in using that technique to treat gut disorders and inflammation.
All right, let's cut to the chase then. Why should people care about their gut?
Well, of course, being a gut researcher, I could write you an essay on that.
Yes.
But I'd say there are two really important reasons people should be interested in their gut. First of all, digestive problems and symptoms associated with the gut are very, very, very common. And that ranges from things like, obviously, heartburn and gastric reflux to nausea, and at the other end, diarrhea and constipation. And those are things that might sound fairly innocuous, actually, but they really make you feel a bit rotten. And in the sort of extreme cases, they can lead to chronic diseases, which we are currently are very hard to treat. And those are the sorts of things that we're trying to develop treatments for at the Florey. So knowing that and avoiding that is really important. So people understanding that and understanding that having a healthy diet and keeping their gut healthy is really important, is going to make life a lot better for people.
And we're not always comfortable sharing that information either. And I suppose this is something that you must come up against all the time, that people they're not necessarily totally honest about those conditions.
Well, exactly, and I think it's interesting because there are some really quite common diseases of the gut that people don't actually know about, and or at least the person on the street might not know about, and I think that's sort of hampered research a little bit. We've got some really nasty gut diseases where we really don't have treatments at all, and part of that's because we've got these big words for them. So We talk about gastroparesis and functional dyspepsia, which are actually pretty common things and very nasty symptoms associated with them. But how do you expect normal people to know what they are when you have names like that?
Yes. So what are some of the common ones that some of our listeners may be suffering from and not necessarily doing anything about, thinking, all right, it's minor, it will go away, and sometimes perhaps they won't go away, it will grow? Yeah.
So I mean, Crohn's disease is a good example of that. So Crohn's disease is inflammation of the intestines and the gut, and leads to things like chronic diarrhea and pain. And if not treated, it can be life-threatening. So you really need to see a doctor if you're having those sorts of symptoms long-term. And one of the important things about these diseases to note is that a lot of them are much easier to prevent than they are to treat. So again, having those conversations about how important a healthy diet is and getting fibre in your diet is, really we want to be, preventing these diseases rather than treating them actually.
Yes.
Those conversations are so important.
Absolutely. And you're putting it down to, you mentioned a healthy diet, but I imagine there's other lifestyle factors.
Look, there are lots of them, and staying healthy in other ways, like having good exercise and not smoking and things like that, is also very important for your gut as well. But of course, the second reason why we really need to understand our guts is because more and more we're finding that actually there's a link between an unhealthy gut and other diseases. In particular, there's a big, strong link between our gut and our brain, as we're finding more and more.
Yes, that's right. The two-way street. The gut is communicating with the brain. Tell us about that.
Well, it turns out that there are lots and lots of ways that the gut and the brain communicate. We've known about this for quite a while, actually. So there are lots of hormones that are released by the gut that act on the brain. Those are sort of molecular messengers which are released into the bloodstream. But there's also, the gut is full of bacteria, and we need those bacteria for a healthy gut. We need to keep the right bacteria in our guts. And those bacteria we know can have effects on the brain by releasing things. But in fact, in both of those cases, possibly the biggest route by which those gut mechanisms affect the brain is via nerves, and those are that carry electrical signals between the brain and the gut, and turn out to be very important. And that's again what we study at the Florey.
And presumably give advice on how those pathways can be clear and there's no blockages. What are the most common little bits of advice that you would give?
Well, I'd start by saying I'm a scientist, not a clinician, so I would never give people advice, personal advice on how to what to do about their particular problem. But we certainly know that eating a healthy diet is really important for preventing gut disorders. But I've been an educator as well, and I really think just understanding how your gut works can allow you to make good choices, good lifestyle choices. Not eating a massive meal and lying down afterwards, things like this. I think really just understanding how your gut works can help a lot. But also, getting fibre in your diet. We also study the evolution of the digestive system, or at least have thought about it a lot. And so, we don't the big changes in diets that have happened more recently in our history, probably contributing to a lot of these digestive diseases we have. One of the biggest changes, of course, most recently, is the huge amounts of refined sugars in our diets, and that's just a fact. It's a huge change that's been in our culture very recently, and adapting to that takes time, and certainly we haven't, in evolutionary terms, we haven't had that time to adapt to those. I think one figure I heard recently was that Australians consume about 45 kilograms of sugar, refined sugar, per person per year, which is just phenomenal, and has been rising. It's only sort of the last few hundred years where humans even had access to that sort of refined sugar. So it's a big change. It's hard for our poor guts to cope with, really.
To cope. Well, let's just think about evolution for a moment and just compare roughly the average gut. It's a great word to say, isn't it? Yep. The average gut in 2021 with, say, something similar. Let's go back, say, 400 years.
Yeah. Well, so 400 years is an interesting time to pick because that's there. We still had diets weren't generally, weren't a lot of refined sugars in our diets back in 400 years ago.
No.
But basically, in evolutionary terms, our guts were the same 400 years ago as they are now. There aren't big changes in our genetics that have occurred over that time, but there are over say 10,000 years, and so our guts are fairly well, adapted, we think, to for instance, cooking of food, which has been around for about 500,000 years. One of my colleagues talks about us humans being cucinivores, which actually just means that our guts are adapted to eating cooked food. So that's a fascinating,
and what difference does
comes
that?
From the fossil record.
Yeah, tell it what difference is that making inside us?
Well, it's got to do with how long our small intestine is. It's got to do with how big our stomachs are and how acidic they are. All those sorts of things are adapted, so we can't eat grass, for instance. We can't eat large amounts of raw meat. There's the animals that eat those sorts of foods have very different guts.
Yes.
And we talk about evolution, and certainly the gut is something that you can seems to evolve very quickly, actually, because animals that are very closely related have different diets, will have very different digestive systems.
Fascinating. Great text has come through, Dr. Martin Stebbing. I should let people know who you are, the head of the Electroceuticals Research Laboratory, the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. Anne has texted in saying, "Hi, Brian. My uncle was called Mudguts, which saw him struggle with frequent toilet visits all his life. When he developed Alzheimer's, he no longer had the gut issues." Can you join any dots?
Well, without being able to go back and actually sample his diet and his activities, etc., that's quite a difficult one. Certainly, I speculate. People have Alzheimer's don't tend to be able to make so many choices about what they're going to eat.
Yes.
So there may have been a change in his diet. But we certainly do know, that, as I said before, the brain affects the gut. So the idea that perhaps, feeling anxious, things like, our emotions certainly affect the guts. We all know that. We all know about, and that's, of course, entered into our language as well. We know that, you feel it in your stomach when you're feeling a bit nervous. You can often, wind up going to the toilet more often when you're nervous. So there certainly is a big effect of the brain on the gut, and it's, I can only speculate that whatever was happening, may have been in that person's situation that might have been contributing, but really, I can't say much about what specifically. But what I would say is that there are certainly a lot of brain diseases, for instance, that are associated with gut problems. For instance, Parkinson's is associated with the high prevalence of constipation, say, for instance. So there definitely those links are there.
Yep. And, of course, Anne just gave us mud guts, and there's a lot of colloquial sayings, aren't there? There's trust your gut. It took a lot of guts. My favourite, and this is a particularly Aussie one, I reckon, as rough as guts. It's very, it's a sort of, it's a colourful term, isn't it?
Yes, and it's a very Australian one. It's an interesting one. Obviously, if you've ever sort of, had a look at a set of human guts or any other animal's guts, they don't look particularly pretty. So maybe that's where it comes from. But the other fascinating part about that is, of course, if you ever eaten tripe or looked at the inside surface of the gut, it is very, very rough.
Yes.
And, of course, the reason for that is that having lots of folds and tiny, even microscopic folds on cells drastically increases the surface area of the gut and makes it much easier to absorb things. So, and of course, absorbing nutrients from your food is something you really need to do to survive. So there's good reasons why that would have developed.
Dr. Martin Stebbing, you have taken us to areas that perhaps we didn't expect to go tonight. Thank you so much. Martin Stebbing, head of the Electroceuticals Research Laboratory, the Florey Institute. I think I just tweaked the pronunciation before. Thanks for your input. Absolutely fascinating. Food for thought.